this is Sana from Ready and Thriving, and today we're going to make Tarte Tatin. It's a wonderful apple pie that is always guaranteed a crispy crust because you actually build it so that you cook the apples and then put the crust on top, and then you'll flip it out, and that creates a wonderful crispy crust, really, really moist and caramelized apples in the center. You can make it with a lot of different fruit, so if you've got a lot of pears or even plums or other types of fruit like that, you can also make this delicious recipe. I'm going to make the traditional one with apples today, and we'll use, here I've got about 8 apples. You can use anywhere really between 6 and 12 apples, so if you do have an apple orchard or an apple tree that is in harvest, this is the perfect thing to make. Likewise, if you have a pear tree or something like that. So a great way to make them into something that you will just never forget. So delicious. Today I'm going to lean heavily on a wonderful recipe from Raymond Blanc, and there will be information in the notes below about the book and the recipe, because it is just really my go-to. I started making it in 2011, as I can see on my actual recipe book, because it's got a lot of notes in it and been used very heavily. So it's a great one. It's so simple. What we have is apples. I use a little bit of citrus just in some water as I'm peeling the apples, just so they don't turn brown, but that isn't in the recipe. Then there's just a smidge of water, so 40 milliliters, so you can see it's actually in there, a very, very small amount, and a bit of sugar. What we'll actually do is we'll just quickly make a little caramel in here in the actual pie pan that we'll make the tart pan. Then we'll put the apples in, then we'll put the crust over top, and all of that will be cooked in this one pan. So you can use a pie pan or even a skillet is a good one, as long as it's an oven-safe skillet. That means basically any skillet that you have that would have a metal handle, no plastic. Then you can even just do it in a regular skillet pan. I do have here, because I do make them so much, an actual Tarte Tatin pan, and this is ceramic, so really heavy ceramic, with both the pan that you cook it in and also a corresponding plate that just fits perfectly that you can flip it over. It is a wonderful, wonderful dessert we're going to make. That's also a great way to eat fruit and to really take care of perhaps what you might have a bigger, bountiful harvest than you can really deal with. This is a great way to use fruit in just a mind-shattering, delicious way. So the real first step of the Tarte Tatin is making sure to make the pastry. So you may have pre-made some puff pastry or pie pastry or a sweet crust pastry. All of those are great. Roll it out so it's nice and fine, like you would for a tart shell or a pie shell. And then cut it so that it's about 1 inch or 2-3 centimeters larger than the actual Tarte Tatin pan that you're using. So in this case, I've got this all nicely cut out and ready. I put it on some parchment paper because the important step here is to get it into that freezer. And that's why we do this first, because we will have the Tarte Tatin come out of the oven really hot, apples steaming, the pot hot, and if you actually have a room temperature pastry, it'll just melt, become a big sticky mess, and that's not what we want. If we do it frozen, we'll be able to put it right on there, and it will soften while it's in our hands enough that we can actually tuck it in and get it back into the oven right away so that it already starts to brown. And then you'll have that really fantastic crispy crust that is really the hallmark of a great Tarte Tatin. So I'm starting with just peeling the apples, and I'll be at this for a while. This is the most labor-intensive part. but it's also, you know, what a joy to be thinking about what is to come of these. So I thought about the type of apple that you would use. Often in baking, you go for a more sour or firm apple like a Granny Smith. That's not really what I'd recommend here. You do want a dessert apple. This is going to be a nice and sweet dessert. But you do also want something that's firm. So there are Cox apples, which are nice. This is a Gala apple, so it's a pretty firm one. It should hold together nicely. It's also a good size because I'm making a smaller tarte tatin. Okay, so I have now peeled all of my apples, and now we'll just cut those, and I'm going to cut them into quarters. This is really when we want to decide how many apples we have and how big is the pan we're going to use. So we can do them in quarters, which I find is a little easier. So if this is your first time to arrange them, try quarters first. Cut these into quarters. And the easiest way to cut them and get the seeds out is to go ahead and cut them into the quarters and then cut at an angle to get the seeds out. Much easier than trying to take them out beforehand. Remember, this is about having a really nice soft texture, so you want to minimize the amount of skin and also keep any stalks or any seeds out of the tarte tatin. I'm going to put these quarters back into that citrus water. Just again, protect them from turning brown, which is not super critical for this recipe in particular because you do put caramel on it. Really no one will know, but it's a real habit of mine that I like to use for apples and pears and anything that might turn brown. You do have a choice when you're making a tarte tatin of how you cut the apples. Sometimes you see really beautiful displays of sliced apples, and other times maybe you see really almost what look like whole apples. So you do have your choices there. My preferred is either to cut into quarters, which I'm showing you here, or to cut them just into halves. And how would you do that? You actually lay them in the pan in their halves in a nice decorative pattern, really smush those together, you know, maybe even a little bit of overlap to get some more height. And that can be a wonderful way too, because they just look almost like caramel apples, so delicious. And it's a good way to use a lot of apples because you'll actually really pile them in there. A smallish like pie pan would still take like 12 apples. So a really good way if you've got a massive harvest to get them in there and to really have a beautiful display. Quarters looks very similar in that, again, you really get that nice look of the whole apples, and we'll see that as we move forward. And so I prefer those. Some people do also slice them and make displays, like a fan display, which to me is really beautiful when done, but it doesn't feel quite as authentic as a tarte tatin to me. A couple words about, where does this come from? Why is it called the tartin? It is after the Tartin sisters who invented it. And they had a little restaurant and B&B where they invented the glorious tarte tatin. So we'll forever remember those two sisters from France who makes this amazing dessert, and one that I think will live on for centuries. The next thing we'll do is we'll make a really light caramel. We just will use that 40 milliliters of water, very small amount. We're going to go ahead and pour it into the pan that we're going to use. There. And then 100 grams of sugar. And I'm just weighing it out right here, keeping it nice and simple. We're not going to overdo the number of dishes that we make. or ingredients that we use in this particular case. Now, I'm just going to make sure that that's really nicely spread and even. All the sugar should be immersed in the water, and it'll start to already dissolve, but we'll leave that to set for about 2 minutes, just at regular room temperature before we put it onto the heat to make the caramel. So while the sugar and water are just sitting, I'm going to prepare the butter that we need. We need in total 90 grams of butter, and while the size of sticks and butter is different in each place, for the American size standard, a standard one is about 110, 115 grams. So I've sliced a bit off here. I just like to put the cutting board actually on the scale, and then I can cut it and know that I've got exactly the right amount. So I'm getting it right to the amount that I need, right to 90. Great. Now the first part I want to do is that we want to separate that out into 60 and 30. We will end up brushing that over the fruit, so we will hold that back for now. Then we've got this nice cold, I just took it out of the refrigerator, so it is nice and cold. That part we are just going to cut into cubes, and that will be appropriate, and that's what we'll use for the caramel. The reason we want this nice and cool is we'll be dumping this into molten sugar in a bit, so it can take the coolness and really bring that temperature down and make a nice buttery caramel. So I've got that already in the right size, so we can begin now to start that caramel. So I will just take that water in the dish that you're making it, put that on to a burner, and then put that onto a medium to high heat, and then we'll watch this like a hawk, because it can turn from beautiful to burnt in no time flat. So you've got a little bit of time right at the beginning, but then we will be over there watching everything. We'll just leave it alone to become nice and soft. What we're looking for is not for it to be fully caramel color yet, because we will be baking it and that will darken it again. So we'll do really just the lightest of caramels. You know, think of just like a cream colored or like the color of hay, just a really soft colored caramels, which we're looking for. We've prepared our butter. Here's the 60 grams diced and ready to be used for the caramel, and I'll put the other 30 grams into a ramekin. We'll just melt that down in the microwave and get that ready for the next step. Watching the sugar and water turn into caramel. Right now it is bubbling, and it's bubbling on all sides and pretty clear. I've just started to see in the hottest part really the bubbles on top start to change color, and they've turned first just a light yellow, and I'm starting to get that now, that soft hay color just around that whole circle. So before we get into any type of burning, that's all the color that I need. I'm just going to set that here. We've got our caramel going. Now, be very careful with this. It is really, really hot, right? Molten. And we want to start to put that butter in, and we'll just stir that in. I have a very high temperature implement here. This is silicone. Don't use plastic in something like this. Wood is also fine, and what I often use as well. Okay, so all that butter in now. So that's cooling that caramel down a bit. At the same time, it's also basically making a wonderful caramel sauce, caramel butter sauce. It is tempting at this stage to stick your finger in, but don't, because you'll end up in the emergency room and that will all go bad. Because it's still warm, remember I said, you know, look for that hay color, really light, right? I took it when just even part of the pan had some of that yellow color. Because this pan is still hot, it's still cooking, and so it's even darkening more, and now it's got a beautiful caramel color already. And keep in mind that it will then go into the oven and will cook even further. So you don't want to, overdo it with how much you do it on the stove to begin with. And now it's time to place the apples. I will actually make a really beautiful design because remember, we're going to tip this out. So what I'm doing now will become the top. What you should do is start with the outside, and traditionally you want to put them so they're the long way. That makes it really seem like, oh, you've got those full apples there. And you want to put them in really nice and tight. You can just start to put them in pretty tight, maybe even a slight overlap. But then as you go through, you'll want to tighten them up even more. So just squeeze those extra apples in. And of course, be careful. It is still a hot pan and you still have hot caramel in there. So the apples are already becoming caramel apples. So I've got the first round of apples in. It looks a bit like a sunflower with all the petals going out and still seeing caramel in the center. Now I'm going to make another round of them, depending on the size, and this is a smaller size. I'm not going to get another full round in, but you may have still room for one or two. So I'm going to kind of push those up a little bit so that they meet in the center. We are going to have a beautiful top come from this. I've got really that kind of first good layer in, and now I really want to make sure that they are compacted together. I can see that I can really push more in. So the first thing I'll do is take one that will form the center, and that one I'll push all the way in. And that's push some of the other apples to make a little bit more space. So now I'll tuck a few more in, just pushing those to the side, and wherever I can get them in, I will add a few more apples. Now, still being careful of that pan because it is a bit hot. You do want to start to squeeze those apples together and make sure that you've got it as tight really as is comfortable. Remember, the apples will bake down a little bit and soften, so don't worry about all the big edges that are sticking up now. That will soften down, and you don't want to have gaps. You want to have a really nice, full and abundant looking tart when we are finished. So once I feel like I just can't get any more apples in, that's when I'll stop. So that did use those full 8 apples except for just a few slices. So I've got a few more slices, and those we can just eat. And I'll just give it another kind of push down, make sure there's kind of equal tension around there. If there was any gaps, then I would just fill that right now, but it looks good. So the next step is that 30 grams of butter, just melted that, and I'm just gonna paint that on. You know, we don't have enough richness already in here with all that caramel. A little extra butter on the top of these apples will be great. Remember, this will go in just like this is, so we want to have that butter on all the surfaces of the apple so that they'll roast really beautifully and nicely in the butter. I just finished putting all of the 30 grams of melted butter onto those apples, so now they're ready for the oven. Remember that tartare pan is still going to be hot, so be careful. And then we will put it into the oven for 30 minutes at 300 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's been 30 minutes. We've had the apples baking. So let's get those out now. Ooh, already smelling delicious. Keep that shut so that we keep that nice and hot. Now this is really hot because now we've got caramel, butter, and hot apples. I've taken my pastry now out of the freezer. You can see it's kind of in an odd shape because of being in the freezer, but already now that I'm putting it over this hot dish, it's already melting. So we just want to lay that on top and then tuck it into the pan. So what this will form is the bottom of the pie and also the sides. So do try to tuck it down in and all the way to the bottom of the pan if you can. Try to get that all the way in. Now you can see here that it was frozen, but no problem that it has now nicely gone in. And we do want it to sit on top of those. And now quickly, I'm going to put it back into the oven for 40 to 45 minutes until it's golden brown. So it's been 45 minutes since we put the top on, and now it's time to take out the tarte tatin. Oh, this looks beautiful. Don't want to tip it too much because we've got some caramel that is still bubbling up. And we've got that nice crust on the top, really super hot still. And it's best if we eat this when it's room temperature or even cool. So we'll let this sit out, let it cool down to room temperature. You can refrigerate it. All right, so we have been letting this rest. It's at room temperature now, and it sure looks really great. Very nice brown and crisp crust. You can even see a little bit of caramelization coming through. And now is the moment of truth when we flip it out and see what it looks like. So we'll just put the plate on top, flip it over, and shake it loose. You can run a knife around the outside. The reveal of the beautiful apples, and look at all that caramel, and they're so tender and soft. And also that crust has a bit of caramel around the outside, but it's crisp on the bottom. Looks fantastic. We're looking forward to having it. You can serve this and it tastes so good with vanilla ice cream or whipped cream. That adds a really nice additional flavor. Hope you enjoyed this and that you were able to use all those apples to make something so delicious. If you'd like to see more recipes that use your garden fruit, garden vegetables, and really just cooking from your pantry, please continue to visit readyandthriving.com and enjoy more great bakes like this one.